All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a shockingly brief event that had just massive, truly enduring global consequences. We're talking about the Spanish-American War of 1898. This is a conflict that lasted, well, barely 3.5 months, and yet it completely redrew the geopolitical lines of the 20th century.
So think about this central question for a second. How did a 109-day conflict permanently change the world map? It's honestly kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? I mean, in just over 100 days, empires fell, a brand new global superpower was born, and the stage was basically set for some of the absolute biggest events of the modern era. Let's find out exactly how that all went down.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Sparking a Global Conflict, a Collision Course. To really get this war, we first have to understand the collision course these two totally different nations were on in the late 19th century.
At that time, the US and Spain were heading in literally opposite directions. The United States was this booming, rising industrial giant. They've got a modern, highly organized navy, and frankly, growing imperial ambitions. They were heavily influenced by this guy, Alfred Thayer Mahan. His theories basically argued that for a nation to be truly great, it absolutely needed naval power and overseas markets. Spain, on the flip side, they're a declining empire. They've got a struggling economy, and their military forces are stretched incredibly thin, just trying to hold on to the last little bits of their once massive colonial territories, mostly Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
Now, the actual spark for this whole thing ignited in Cuba, which had already been fighting an insurgency for independence from Spain since 1895. The Spanish military under General Valeriano Weyler instituted this incredibly brutal policy known as reconcentrado. Basically, they forcibly herded Cuban civilians into camps just to isolate the rebels, and the conditions were just horrific. Tens of thousands of people died from disease and starvation. When word of this inevitably reached the US, it generated this massive, widespread public outrage.
And man, the media absolutely fanned that outrage into a total frenzy. Listen to this incredibly famous, though honestly, possibly apocryphal, quote attributed to the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Hearst, along with his fierce rival Joseph Pulitzer, were locked in this ruthless circulation war. They essentially pioneered what we call yellow journalism. They were publishing these highly sensationalized, often completely exaggerated accounts of Spanish atrocities just to sell more papers. They were the prime movers in pushing the American public toward wanting an intervention.
Then, boom, the match hits the powder keg. On February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded right in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. Now, historians today actually believe it was likely an accidental internal explosion, but back then, no way. The yellow press immediately screamed sabotage. The phrase "remember the Maine" became this deafening, literal war cry across the country. You add in a leaked private letter from a Spanish diplomat named Delome, where he basically called President William McKinley weak, and public opinion just reached a boiling point. McKinley himself was actually very reluctant, but the pressure was just too much. By April 25, 1898, Congress formally declared war.
So the war is officially on. And that brings us to Section 2, War in Two Oceans, the Pacific and the Caribbean. What makes this so wild is the unbelievable speed and the massive geographical scope of the actual fighting.
Just look at how rapidly this whole thing built. It's a stunning domino effect. February, the explosion. April, the declaration of war. By May, there's a huge victory in the Pacific. By July, decisive victories in Cuba. And by August, a ceasefire is already signed. I mean, for a war spanning 2 oceans, that is a stunningly compressed timeline.
Let's look closely at that first major engagement. Crazy enough, it didn't even happen in Cuba. It happened halfway around the world in the Philippines. At the Battle of Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey commanded the U.S. Asiatic Squadron and completely obliterated the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a single morning. And get this, they did it with 0 American casualties. None. It was this virtually bloodless, totally stunning victory that made Dewey an instant national hero. The U.S. now effectively controlled the waters around the Philippines, and Dewey actually started collaborating with a Filipino nationalist leader named Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo believed the Americans were there to support his goal of Philippine independence. Now, definitely keep Aguinaldo in mind, because that assumption is going to have some really severe consequences very soon.
Meanwhile, back over in the Caribbean, the Cuban campaign was a totally different story. The U.S. Army was pretty small, and their mobilization was rapid but incredibly chaotic. Still, it produced some absolutely legendary stories. You had Theodore Roosevelt basically resigning his desk job to organize the Rough Riders, which was this wild volunteer cavalry made up of Ivy Leaguers and cowboys. You also had the incredible heroism of the Buffalo Soldiers, these African-American regiments who played a totally pivotal role in storming San Juan Hill.
Eventually, after a decisive naval victory at Santiago de Cuba, where the Spanish fleet was totally wiped out, Spain surrendered in July. But here's the grim reality. The true devastation for the U.S. wasn't from combat. Tropical diseases, like yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery, actually killed far more American soldiers in Cuba than Spanish bullets ever did.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer concentration of historical heavyweights all involved in this tiny little window of time. You've got McKinley reluctantly leading the charge, Theodore Roosevelt essentially using San Juan Hill as a springboard to his future presidency, Dewey as the ultimate naval hero, Weyler as the face of Spanish brutality, Aguinaldo fighting for his nation's freedom, and Hearst behind the scenes pulling the strings of public perception. This single short conflict acted as a massive historical crossroads for all these huge figures.
Okay, so the fighting pauses in just over 3 months. Section 3, A Splendid Little War. The reality check. The American public was absolutely ecstatic, but the true, long-term cost of this conflict was just about to show itself.
This quote perfectly captures the American illusion at the time. Secretary of State John Hay literally called it a splendid little war. For the U.S., it was short, it was decisive, and in terms of actual combat, it was incredibly cheap in American lives. It really felt like this easy, glorious triumph.
But then, you hit this staggering reality check. 200,000 to 1 million. That is the estimated number of Filipino deaths, and that includes civilians, disease, and famine, in the direct, immediate aftermath of this quote-unquote splendid little war.
Which leads us right into Section 4, the brutal aftermath, the Philippine-American War, from 1899 to 1902. The Spanish-American War was over, sure, but the Philippine-American War was literally just getting started. Remember Emilio Aguinaldo? Well, when it became crystal clear that the United States fully intended to colonize the Philippines rather than liberate them, Aguinaldo launched a fierce armed insurgency against the Americans. And what followed was a brutal guerrilla conflict that lasted officially until 1902. And it reveals this profound, really grim irony. Because in attempting to suppress this Filipino insurgency, American forces employed incredibly harsh tactics. They even set up their own version of the exact same reconcentration camps they had originally gone to war to stop Spain from using back in Cuba.
So how did the U.S. officially get control of the Philippines in the first place? That happened through the momentous Treaty of Paris, which was negotiated in December 1898 to formally end the war with Spain. The terms here were huge. Cuba was granted independence, though, note, heavily influenced by the U.S., which is when they established the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Puerto Rico and Guam were outright ceded to the United States. And the Philippines? They were sold by Spain to the U.S. for $20 million. Literally with the stroke of a pen, America expanded its global footprint immensely.
But, as you can imagine, this treaty triggered a massive domestic backlash. You had the Anti-Imperialist League, which featured huge names. I mean, we're talking author Mark Twain, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and former President Grover Cleveland. And they argued passionately against this. They basically stated that annexing the Philippines blatantly violated America's core democratic principles. The war also exposed some deep racial hypocrisies. Anti-imperialists pointed out the sheer contradiction of a nation that was actively denying civil rights to its own black citizens, like those heroic Buffalo soldiers who returned home only to face Jim Crow segregation, now claiming some mandate to civilize others abroad. The debate at home was so fierce that the Treaty of Paris passed the U.S. Senate by only a single vote. Just one vote.
But the treaty did pass, and the map was permanently changed. Let's look at Section 5, the new American Empire, Significance and Legacy.
So what are the big picture takeaways we should remember here? First, this was unequivocally the birth of the American Empire in the definitive end of the Spanish Empire. In fact, back in Spain, this triggered a deep national identity crisis known as the Generation of '98. Second, it launched the totally meteoric political rise of Theodore Roosevelt, basically rocketing him straight toward the presidency. Third, it absolutely confirmed Alfred Thayer Mahan's doctrines about U.S. naval supremacy. And finally, the whole thing with Hearst and Pulitzer? That left us with enduring, incredibly critical questions about media manipulation, sensationalism, and how the press can quite literally drive an entire nation to war.
But maybe the most tangible legacy is strategic geography. By taking control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, the United States gained these highly critical naval bases and officially positioned itself as a major Pacific power. To put that into perspective, this specific geographic shift set the stage directly for the massive global conflicts of the 20th century. The U.S. presence in the Pacific, which was established right here in 1898, is exactly what eventually positioned them in the crosshairs of events like the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. We started by asking how a little 109-day war changed the map. And we've seen how it launched an American empire, ended a Spanish one, and sparked these really intense debates on media, race, and imperialism that honestly sound incredibly familiar to us right now. So, looking out at our modern geopolitical landscape and thinking about the role of the media in our current world, how does the shadow of 1898 still shape our world today? I'll leave you to chew on that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the history that builds our present.